Hello, and welcome to the webinar, Quality and Sustainability for a Stronger Supply Chain. Thank you for taking the time to view our webinar. Scott Blakely is the Lab Services Director for Intertech Calebret. Scott is a member of ASTM and an active member for several D16 subcommittees. Scott also has a Bachelor of Science degree in biochemistry from the University of Illinois and has a vast array of experience with over 19 years in the industry. Scott also just published his first science fiction novel, Expelled from the Moon. Andrea Forsyth is the laboratory manager at Intertech Agri Services in New Orleans, Louisiana. Andrea received her bachelor's in biological sciences from the University of New Orleans, where she later completed her doctorate in chemistry. She is currently working towards a master's degree in microbiology at the University of Florida. Andrea joined Intertech in 2018. With that, I would like to begin our presentation.
Good morning. My name is Andrea Forsyth. I am Laboratory Manager at Intertech Agri Services in New Orleans. And today's topic, I'll be talking about the role for agriculture and sustainability. Next slide, please. So let's start from the beginning. Agriculture developed around 10,000 BC and is defined as the cultivation of plants and animals. And while our practice of agriculture has certainly changed, the purpose has not. Populations require dependable sources for food and energy, and as such, our key focuses are on reliability, productivity, and the continued push for sustainability. Our focus today will be on how agricultural products can help us with sustainability and our energy supply chain. We will focus on quality parameters of feedstocks for biodiesel. Next slide, please. To give you an overview of this process, let's start with some feedstocks currently used within the United States. As you can see, the majority of these feedstocks are vegetable in origin, predominantly soybean oil. Some of these feedstocks come from products which would otherwise be considered inedible or waste streams, those of used cooking oil, animal fats and greases, and some of the corn oil listed. Each of these feedstocks are replenishable by different mechanisms, and based on their characteristics, they may be able to be used as a renewable source for energy. To show you how they fit into this process, let's go over an overview of the production of biodiesel, or fatty acid methyl ester. We will start with an oil which may need to undergo some additional refining, such as to go through degumming, as with soybean oil, or sediment removal in used cooking oil. From here, the oil will go transesterification. This process involves the use of methanol and typically an alkali catalyst, such as sodium hydroxide or potassium hydroxide. This reaction essentially breaks down the triglyceride portion of the fat into biodiesel, or the fatty acid methyl ester, and glycerol. From here, we can take those two products and separate them. The biodiesel is washed and then dried before its use as fuel. So what are some of the parameters which make a good biodiesel? There are a few guidelines that you can use, but I'll focus today on AOCS CK 1-07, which is predominantly used in agricultural laboratories. This won't be an exhaustive review of quality parameters, but just to give you an overall feel for some important things to consider. Next slide. So these quality parameters can be broken down into 5 major classes: the cleanliness of the sample, the purity of the sample, impurities currently within the sample, the oxidative stability of the feedstock, and the fatty acid composition. Next slide. The cleanliness of the sample is essentially the foreign material that's currently present within it. These may cause issues downstream of your processes and should be removed. The insoluble impurities are impurities which cannot be dissolved. This is the I part of MIU, which I'll discuss very briefly at the end of the presentation. Sedimentation is foreign material which can be separated by centrifugation and is given as milliliters per 100 grams of sample. Polyethylene is a special contaminant that is very common in animal fats and oils such as tallow, and sometimes used cooking oil. Polyethylene finds its way into the product by way of meat wrappers which have congealed to the meat during the processing plant. We could perform this test by hydrolyzing the fat and then separating the polyethylene and measuring it. Next slide, please. The impurities within the sample are common constituents. These are things such as moisture. Excessive moisture can impact the transesterification process and reduce the total conversion of the triglycerides to FAME. It may also result in the production of byproducts which are unwanted, such as soap. There are several methods to measure the moisture levels within the sample. The first two are loss on drying methods, the hot plate and the oven. The Carl Fisher method gives an idea of the moisture within the sample via titration. Now, the acidity, or free fatty acids, is the measure of the free fatty acids within the product. The free fatty acids reduce the effectiveness of your catalyst and the conversion to FAME. It may lead to byproducts such as soap, and if the acidity is too high, the transesterification process will not proceed. There's two ways of measuring this or reporting this. The free fatty acids are going to be the direct measure of the free fatty acids currently within the sample. It's typically given as a weight percent azelaic or another fatty acid, depending on your choice of feedstock. The acid value is a bit more general and is given as milligrams of potassium hydroxide per gram of sample. This is essentially how much potassium hydroxide is needed to neutralize the fatty acid present. These two values can be interconverted to one another. Next slide. Thank you. The purity of the sample is essentially the amount of triglyceride present within the sample. Some common tests are the unsaponifiable matter, polar compounds, and soap. I'll focus today on unsaponifiable matter. Unsaponifiable matter is the portion of feedstock which is not triglyceride and cannot be converted into a soap nor refined further to become a FAME. These are typically compounds which are common in fats and oils, such as hydrocarbons like squalene, sterols such as stigmasterol, which is found in soybean oil, triterpenoids, fatty alcohols, antioxidants such as tocopherol or beta-carotene, which you can see here, and other non-volatile contaminants. Excessive unsaponifiable matter will lower the fatty acid methyl ester content within the finished product, so care should be taken to measure this in your feedstock. Next slide, please. Another quality parameter to consider is the stability of your feedstock. We can measure this a few ways, and we'll start with the oxidative stability. The oxidative stability of the fat or the oil is its resistance to oxidation during storage or use. You can think of this as a test of how long it will take the fat to go rancid. Typically what happens is that your feedstock resists oxidation very well up until a certain point in time, after which the oxidation process will accelerate very rapidly. We use OSI to perform an accelerated shelf life study of the feedstock. We perform this test by passing a stream of purified air through the sample and then capturing any breakdown products within a tube of deionized water. The measure of the conductivity of the water gives us an idea of the length of the shelf life of the feedstock. Typically, biodiesel and biodiesel feedstocks have a much shorter shelf life than their petroleum analogs. This is a predictive test. To give you a better idea of the current rancidity of the sample, there are other tests that we can use. The peroxide value determines all substances in terms of milliequivalents of peroxide per 1,000 grams of sample. This is a titration-based test, and the substances are generally assumed to be peroxides or other similar products of fat oxidation or rancidity. Another test that we can perform is the pianisidine value. This test gives us an approximate amount of the aldehydes present within the sample. These aldehydes are products of rancidity. Next slide, please. The final group of quality parameters we'll discuss today are the fatty acid composition. So the primary one is fatty acid composition or fatty acid profile. This is performed by converting the fat into FAME and then analyzing it via GC. This gives us a breakdown of which fatty acids are present within the sample. And from here, we can get an idea of the amount of unsaturated versus saturated fats. This in turn gives us a better idea of the stability of both the feedstock as well as the biodiesel. Typically, the more unsaturated fatty acids present, the less stable the feedstock. There are other tests which can also give us an idea of the composition of the oil. Next slide, please. Those tests are iodine value and saponification value. The iodine value can be calculated with the analysis above or can be performed as a standalone test. This is a parameter of the degree of unsaturation within the sample. The higher the number, the greater the degree of or number of unsaturated bonds. Oils have traditionally been grouped based on this number into three groups: the drying oils, semi-drying oils, and non-drying oils. Drying oils have a value of 200 to 130. They have much more double bonds and contain oils such as linseed oil. Semi-drying oils have an iodine value around 130 to 100 and include oils such as safflower or corn. Non-drying oils have an iodine value of less than 100 and contain much more saturated bonds. These are oils such as olive oil. Iodine value has a limit set by EN 14214 of not more than 120. Typically, fatty acids have a higher iodine value than triglycerides, so that should be of special importance to used cooking oil use. The saponification value is a measure of the mean molecular weight of the fatty acids present within the sample. It's inversely related to the average molecular weight of the fatty acid within the oil, so a small value indicates a longer average fatty acid chain length. Next slide, please. Now, there are many other tests that we can use to evaluate the quality of the feedstock, but it'll really depend on what your choice is. I have a number listed here, but I'll only go over a few. The phosphorus and phospholipids is particularly important in the case of vegetable oils, as these can cause problems during the transesterification process as well as the purification process. MIU is very important. This is moisture, insoluble impurities, and unsaponifiable matter. Typically, these tests are grouped together for a snapshot of quality, as each of these factors can lower the overall conversion of the feedstock into FAME. These feedstocks that we've discussed briefly represent a group of commodities which can help us reduce our dependence on non-renewable sources. And knowing more about these quality parameters can help you evaluate potential feedstocks for use. Thank you for joining me today and spending your time with me. I'll now turn you over to Scott Blakely.
Thank you, Andrea. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Blakely, and I'm the Director of Laboratories for Intertek Calibret North America. So why would we want to take food from our tabletops and use it for energy? So there's a strong argument for sustainability since it's a renewable fuel and it can be continuously grown by our farmers, but it really all started with their clean air properties. So on the top of this slide is a ethanol molecule, and on the bottom is a fatty acid methyl ester molecule, better known as biodiesel. And both of these contain oxygen atoms that allow the fuel to burn cleaner. So air pollution concerns might be traced back to the Great Smog of London in 1952. It occurred over a 4-day period, and air pollution was so bad that you could literally only see for a few feet. An estimated 4,000 people died and over 100,000 people were made ill. Similar smog events were happening more frequently in other cities. The U.S. enacted the Clean Air Act of 1970 to combat air pollution. So in the early 1980s, they began blending methyl tertiary butyl ether, MTBE, into gasoline. Now, it was still produced from petroleum, so it wasn't a renewable fuel, but it did greatly assist the clean burning of gasoline and reduce air pollution and smog. Unfortunately, when this oxygenated gasoline came into contact with groundwater, the MTBE migrated to the water table, which was bad. Nobody wanted smelly, harmful chemicals in their drinking water. So the US EPA banned the use of MTBE and mandated ethanol use for highly populated areas. Ethanol is clean burning, it's a renewable fuel, and while it could still migrate to the water table, we didn't fear that. Just throw an olive in it and it's good to go. So ethanol has some great benefits when blended into gasoline. So it has the oxygen atom that helps complete combustion and reduces air pollution. It's also an octane booster. So if you blend 10% ethanol into 84 octane gasoline, it makes it 87 octane gasoline. So there's a +3 octane boost. And it's also a renewable, sustainable fuel. And the energy shortages in the 1970s had added that as a priority. So our farmers can now grow energy rather than just importing it. But there's quite a few cons also with blending ethanol into gasoline. It's highly hydrophilic, so that means that it can absorb water to the point where both the ethanol and the water will fall out of the gasoline to make it unusable. Being hydrophilic, it can't be transported by pipeline due to risk of coming in contact with water. That means that the ethanol has to be stored and blended downstream from the refinery just prior to the gas station. So that increases handling costs. And then additionally, the rainwater must be kept from underground storage tanks at the gas station since it can cause major problems with phase separation and creating unusable gasoline. The specifications for fuel ethanol are listed in ASTM D4806, and they include 10 critical quality parameters. Primarily among them is the purity of the ethanol, and that's tested by gas chromatography. That test will also tell us the methanol content, which has a maximum spec. We also determine the water content by a titration test. And then the rest of the fuel ethanol is primarily made up of denaturant, which is added to the ethanol to make it unfit for human consumption. So they basically add a little bit of gasoline to it so that you can't drink it. There are potential contaminant impurities from the production that must also be tested for. So we test for the sulfur content because when that's burned, it turns into sulfur dioxide, which contributes to acid rain. We test for acidity and PHE, which can contribute to corrosion. We test for sulfate and inorganic chloride, which can cause particulate to fall out and plug fuel filters. I've actually seen an ethanol sample containing so much aluminum sulfate that it looked like a snow globe. We test for the gum content, which can contribute to gumming of engine parts. And we test copper content, which can also cause gum formation. So ethanol is generally blended into gasoline as E10, which is 10% ethanol and 90% gasoline. There's also the flex fuels, which are E75 to E85, which is 75 to 85% ethanol. They still contain 15 to 25% gasoline, which helps with cold weather startup. Some countries, such as Brazil, use E100, which is 100% ethanol. Now, biodiesel came to the market in the 1990s for many of the same reasons as ethanol. So it's a renewable, sustainable fuel grown by farmers. It contains 2 oxygen atoms to promote clean burning and reduce air pollution. And it also has a high cetane number, so it has good engine performance. But the transesterification of oil to biodiesel increases potential quality concerns, which have limits that are specified in ASTM D6751. So biodiesel has that very high cetane number, so there is a boost when blended into diesel fuel. It also has a great lubricity effect, which is very beneficial since ultra low sulfur diesel doesn't have that and requires additives, so biodiesel helps the lubricity. Biodiesel also has very low sulfur content, which is good for our air. But there's a lot of quality tests that we also have to test for the biodiesel since cloud point. It has a high cloud point, which can affect cold weather operability. And can make it difficult to blend biodiesel in the wintertime. The cold soak filterability test helps us to identify fuels that have potential for solids dropping out after cold storage. And these are generally attributed to a combination of monoglycerides, steroglucosides, soap, and water that might be present. We test for the amount of mono, free, and total glycerides. And like we said earlier, biodiesel doesn't have a long shelf life and can turn rancid, so we test the oxidation stability. If it does turn rancid, the acid number goes up, so we also test for the acid number and the copper corrosion. We test for ash content, which can be caused by inorganic materials such as sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus. We run distillation to show that the oil has been completely converted to fatty acid methyl ester. We run flash point to show that the methanol from transesterification process has been completely removed. But there are some additional biodiesel concerns. So it's not yet intended to be used as B100, but rather as a blend component into diesel fuel. It has some great solvent effects, but that can be a problem too with old fuel systems. There was a cruise ship that attempted to use B100 as a fuel, and it cleaned up so much of the old sludge in the tanks that it clogged up fuel filters and had to be continually changed. And biodiesel cannot be transported by pipeline for fear of getting into the jet fuel stream. So like ethanol, it has to be blended into the diesel fuel downstream from the refiner and just before the service station. So there are additional handling costs. For many of you, there's one last thing that you might want to consider, and that's whether or not your biodiesel is vegan. So biodiesel is made from transesterification of vegetable oils or tallow oils, and tallow oils are animal byproducts. Biodiesel generally is composed of a mixture of fatty acid methyl ester isomers, C16, C17, C18, 1, 2, and 3. But only the C17 FAME isomer comes from animal feedstock sources. So if we tested and determined that there was no C17, you may have a vegan biodiesel. Now, renewable diesel fuels are now available, and they're different from biodiesel. They're produced at a refinery that hydroprocesses bio-oils to create molecules that are chemically the same as conventional diesel fuel. So they hydrotreat triglycerides into alkane molecules, and these have better cold flow properties. They're still clean burning with no aromatics or sulfur. So in your diesel tank now, you might have diesel fuel that's a blend of conventional petroleum-based diesel fuel, biodiesel, and renewable diesel fuel. All three of them might be in the tank. Now, the future might be with hydrogen, which is used in hydrogen fuel cells. So hydrogen combusts with oxygen to release a lot of energy and water, so there's no pollution. But then there may be pollution from how the hydrogen's produced. So how is that hydrogen going to be produced? So while hydrogen is actually a colorless gas, we color code hydrogen for its refining source, where it comes from. So currently we call brown hydrogen hydrogen that's created from coal with CO2 released into the atmosphere. So there's still pollution. Similarly, gray hydrogen is created from the cleaner natural gas, but still with the CO2 released into the atmosphere. Blue hydrogen will be created from natural gas, but with carbon capture. So the carbon won't be released to the atmosphere, it'll be stored. Green hydrogen is created from electrolysis of water, breaking the water molecule to oxygen and hydrogen. It's broken with clean electricity from wind or hydropower. Yellow hydrogen is also created from electrolysis, but using solar power. And then there's pink hydrogen that's going to be created from electrolysis using nuclear power. They're still working on other technologies and other sources, and there may be in the future turquoise and white hydrogen, but hydrogen is a future energy source that may be a supplement or replacement for our current energy.